There are wolves who announce their power with fanfare and fury, leaving claw marks on marble floors and bloodstains on silk banners as monuments to their dominance. Then there are those who carry death so quietly that it arrives like frost, inevitable, invisible, already inside you before you realize the temperature has dropped. Warriors who understand that true lethality requires no crown, no ceremony, no recognition beyond the cold mathematics of survival and extinction. Nyra Valerius belonged to the latter, though the Lycan aristocracy of Ironblood Citadel would have laughed at the suggestion. To them, she was simply Sailor, another human maid, expendable and unremarkable, existing only to refill crystal goblets and endure casual cruelty with the practiced invisibility that kept servants breathing in a court of monsters. She had perfected this performance over 3 years of meticulous patience, learning to navigate the cathedral-like halls of the citadel like smoke through stone, never quite solid enough to invite scrutiny, never quite absent enough to be accused of shirking duty. Her sleeves stayed long to conceal the network of scars that mapped a history no servant should possess. Her posture stayed bent to hide the coiled readiness in her spine. Her voice stayed measured to avoid triggering the predatory instincts that turned royal festivities into feeding frenzies. And her storm-gray eyes stayed lowered to prevent anyone from glimpsing the calculations running behind them. For behind those eyes lived the memories of Project Nightstalk, of laboratories that didn't exist in any official records, of training that had transformed flesh and bone into something that could hunt the hunters. The woman who had authored protocols for killing supernatural beings still existed beneath the servant's carefully maintained disguise. The architect of a program designed to forge humans into weapons against an unkillable enemy had not forgotten a single lesson. But Nyra had learned to bury that identity so completely that even her own reflection sometimes looked like a stranger, buried it so deep that sometimes she almost believed the mask was all that remained, until the Night Prince Kaelan Vane decided that breaking a human maid would provide entertaining spectacle for his sycophantic companions during the Harvest Moon banquet. Until the moment his bone-crushing kick sliced through candlelit air toward ribs he expected to shatter like porcelain. Until Nyra's body responded with reflexes honed in wars the kingdom's history books had been rewritten to erase. And the carefully constructed fiction of the helpless servant Sailor cracked just enough to reveal something far more dangerous bleeding through the fractures. What happened next lasted only 3 heartbeats, but its consequences would detonate through the Lycan hierarchy like a poison they had already swallowed, spreading through bloodlines in ways they couldn't yet detect, couldn't yet comprehend, because the deadliest predator in the Ironblood Citadel had never been the one wearing a crown. She had been the one holding the serving tray. The Ironblood Citadel had been built to remind its occupants of their place in the natural order. 7 centuries of Lycan supremacy had carved itself into every stone archway, every iron-wrought chandelier, every portrait of snarling ancestors whose eyes seemed to track human servants as they scurried through holes wide enough to swallow screams. The architecture itself was a lesson in dominance. Vaulted ceilings that made mortals feel appropriately small, corridors designed to echo the distinctive cadence of clawed footsteps, windows positioned to cast shadows that resembled wolves mid-leap across marble floors. Nyra had learned to read the citadel's geography like a battlefield map. The eastern wings where human staff were relegated smelled of lye soap and resignation, cramped quarters stacked 3 stories below ground where natural light was a luxury reserved for those with fangs. The western galleries belonged to the aristocracy, perfumed with imported incense that couldn't quite mask the underlying musk of predators who had never learned to fully suppress their baser instincts. And the central throne room, that cathedral of cruelty, where the High King held court beneath a ceiling painted with scenes of the Great Purge, the war that had reduced humanity from equals to livestock. The message was reinforced in 1,000 small degradations. Human servants entered rooms on their knees if Lycan nobility were present. They were forbidden from making direct eye contact, from speaking unless addressed, from existing in any way that might suggest they considered themselves anything more than animated furniture. Nyra had watched a kitchen maid flogged for the crime of sneezing during a state dinner, the sound having briefly interrupted a chancellor's anecdote. She had seen a stable boy thrown from a 3rd-story window because his pulse had accelerated in fear, and a young Lycan had found the scent offensively pungent. These were not aberrations. They were the standard. The Citadel operated on a careful calculus of terror. Humans were kept numerous enough to be useful but never comfortable enough to organize. They were rotated between duties to prevent relationships from forming, worked hard enough to ensure exhaustion, fed well enough to remain functional but never so well they might forget their hunger. It was a system refined over generations, as efficient as it was merciless, designed to break spirits long before bodies gave out. And it worked. Naira had seen it work. Had watched new arrivals, those sold by desperate families or captured from the borderlands, transform from defiant to defeated in a matter of weeks. The Citadel had a way of teaching its lessons through the language of pain and disappearance. Servants who resisted vanished into the lower dungeons and returned hollow-eyed, if they returned at all. Those who proved unsuitable were sold to the fighting pits or the pleasure houses, fate spoken of in whispers that made even hardened staff pale. So the humans of Ironblood Citadel learned to make themselves small, to move through the world like ghosts haunting the periphery of Lycan consciousness. They learned that survival meant becoming forgettable, that safety lay in being so thoroughly unremarkable that predatory attention slid past without catching. Naira had learned these lessons better than most. She had to. Because while the other servants were simply trying to survive another day, she was playing a longer game with stakes that would make the Citadel's carefully maintained hierarchy look like a child's tower of blocks, fragile, temporary, and about to come crashing down. The Harvest Moon banquet had been in full swing for 3 hours when Prince Kalen Vane decided he was bored. Naira recognized the signs from across the great hall, the way his fingers drummed against his goblet stem, the particular tilt of his head that suggested his mind was wandering toward dangerous territory, the smile that never reached his eyes as he surveyed the room like a child surveying a toy box full of things already broken. She had been refilling wine carafes along the western wall, maintaining the careful choreography of invisibility that had kept her breathing for 3 years. But she felt the shift in atmosphere the moment the prince's attention sharpened, felt it the way prey animals sense the predator's gaze settling on their location in the herd. "Tell me, Lord Castor," Kalen's voice cut through the ambient noise of clinking silverware and sycophantic laughter, pitched just loud enough to draw the attention of nearby tables. "Do you believe humans experience fear the way we do? Or is it merely instinct, like a rabbit freezing before the wolf?" The question was rhetorical. Kalen Vane had a reputation for conducting what he called philosophical inquiries that typically ended with someone bleeding. He was the High King's 3rd son, which meant he had enough royal blood to be untouchable but not enough responsibility to temper his cruelties with pragmatism. The court had learned to recognize his particular brand of boredom as a warning sign, the way sailors recognized the stillness before a storm. "I confess I've never studied the matter closely, Your Highness," Lord Castor replied with the careful neutrality of a man who knew better than to encourage but couldn't afford to offend. "Then perhaps a demonstration is in order." Kalen rose from his seat with the fluid grace of someone who had never doubted his right to occupy space. His eyes swept the hall, and Naira felt them pass over her like a hand checking fruit for ripeness. "We have ample subjects available. It would be wasteful not to further our understanding of the natural world." Several of the younger nobles laughed, the kind of laughter that required no actual humor, only the desire to align oneself with power. Naira kept her movements steady, kept her breathing even, kept her expression carefully blank as she reached for another carafe. 3 years of practice had taught her how to become a piece of the scenery, how to exist in that psychological blind spot where predators simply didn't register prey as worth noticing. But Kalen was hunting for something specific tonight. Something that would break the tedium of another state dinner, another evening of predictable pleasantries and court politics. He wanted entertainment, and entertainment required a victim who would provide satisfying reactions. Fear, pain, humiliation performed for an audience that would appreciate the artistry of cruelty. His gaze settled on Naira with the finality of a trap closing. "You there. The maid with the wine." His voice carried the lazy confidence of someone who had never been denied anything. "Come here. I have a theory about human reflexes I'd like to test." The conversations around them died in ripples, heads turning to watch what everyone recognized as the prelude to sport. Naira felt the weight of dozens of eyes, some curious, some sympathetic, most simply grateful the prince's attention had landed elsewhere. She set down the carafe with movements that betrayed nothing of the calculations running beneath her carefully maintained facade. She had known this moment would come eventually, had prepared for it, planned for it, run through scenarios in the dark hours before dawn. But knowing and experiencing were different things, and as she crossed the marble floor toward Prince Kalen Vane, she made the same choice she had made 3 years ago when she had first walked through the Citadel's gates. She would give him exactly what he asked for. Just not in the way he expected. Prince Kaelan waited until she was close enough to smell the expensive wine on his breath, close enough that the court could see every detail of what he planned to do. He wanted an audience for this, wanted witnesses to confirm his dominance, wanted the story to spread through servant quarters as a reminder of what happened when humans forgot their place. "Kneel," he commanded, and there was a particular pleasure in his voice that suggested he already knew how the next few minutes would unfold. The girl would kneel, would beg perhaps, would certainly cry. They always did. And then he would demonstrate the difference between Lycan and human durability in ways that would be discussed in hushed tones for weeks. Nyra lowered herself to her knees with the same practiced deference she had displayed 1,000 times before. Her head stayed bowed, her hands folded in her lap, her entire posture a study in submission. Around them, the great hall had fallen into that particular silence that accompanies anticipated violence, the kind of hush that sharpens rather than softens the atmosphere. "I've often wondered," Kaelan continued, circling her slowly, "whether human fragility is physical or psychological. Whether your bones break more easily than ours, or whether you simply lack the constitution to endure what we would consider minor discomfort." He paused behind her, and Nyra could feel the shift in his weight, could read the telegraphed intention in the way the air displaced around his moving form. "Let's begin with something simple." The kick came without further warning, a calculated strike aimed at her ribs with enough force to shatter bone and collapse a lung. Kaelan had done this before, had perfected the angle and velocity required to cause maximum damage without immediately killing. He wanted her conscious for what came next, wanted her aware enough to scream. The impact never landed. Nyra's hand came up in a movement too fast for most of the observers to track, catching his ankle mid-strike with a precision that spoke of thousands of hours of training. Her fingers found the pressure points with surgical accuracy, not just stopping the kick but redirecting its momentum, using his own strength against him. The crack of bone meeting bone echoed through the sudden silence, but it wasn't her ribs that had absorbed the impact. She rose to her feet in the same fluid motion, still holding his leg at an angle that forced him off balance, forced him to recognize that the power dynamic had shifted in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Her storm-gray eyes met his for the first time, and what he saw there made something cold slither down his spine. Was that supposed to hurt? Her voice was quiet, conversational even, but it carried through the hall with perfect clarity. The submissive servant who had knelt before him was gone, replaced by something that moved with the controlled lethality of a blade being drawn from its sheath. Kaelan tried to jerk his leg free and discovered he couldn't. Tried to shift his weight to throw a punch and found his balance completely compromised. His training had prepared him for combat against other Lycans, against opponents who fought with fang and claw and overwhelming physical superiority. It had not prepared him for someone who understood leverage and anatomy and the precise application of force required to turn a body's own structure into a cage. "I asked you a question, Your Highness." Nyra's grip tightened fractionally, and Kaelan felt tendons strain in ways they were never meant to move. The pain was sharp and immediate and utterly unlike anything he had experienced in his carefully sheltered existence. When you aimed that kick at what you assumed were human ribs, at bones you believed would shatter like porcelain, was that supposed to hurt me? Or was it supposed to teach me something? The great hall remained frozen, every noble and servant caught in the shocked paralysis of watching something impossible unfold. A human maid was holding the prince immobile, was speaking to him without deference or fear, was asking questions that carried the weight of a threat that everyone suddenly understood she could make good on. Kaelan opened his mouth, whether to scream or command or beg, no one would ever know. Because in the next heartbeat, Nyra moved again, and the prince's world tilted sideways as she swept his supporting leg and guided his fall with the kind of effortless control that comes from practice that borders on art. Prince Kaelan Vane hit the marble floor with a sound that echoed through the great hall like a judge's gavel. The impact drove the air from his lungs in an undignified wheeze, but before he could process what had happened, before his body could activate the enhanced healing that made Lycans so difficult to kill, Nyra was already moving to her next position. She dropped her knee onto his spine with calculated precision, the pressure point selected to immobilize without causing permanent damage. Her left hand secured his wrist, bending it at an angle that made his fingers spasm open uselessly. Her right hand pressed against the back of his skull, not hard enough to injure but firm enough to communicate absolute control. The entire sequence had taken less than 3 seconds from the moment his kick had failed to connect, a masterclass in combat efficiency that left no room for counterattack or escape. The prince struggled. Of course he struggled. His breeding demanded it, his pride required it, his training insisted that a Lycan could overpower any human through sheer physical superiority. He tried to shift his weight, tried to leverage his greater strength, tried to activate the partial transformation that would flood his muscles with supernatural power. Nothing worked. Every attempt to move was countered before it fully formed, every surge of strength redirected into angles that made his own body betray him. Naira's positioning was perfect, her weight distribution engineered to make his advantages meaningless. She had learned to fight things stronger and faster than herself, had been forged in a crucible specifically designed to answer the question of how humans could hunt monsters. And the answer was this: superior technique, perfect timing, and the kind of tactical precision that turned anatomy into mathematics. The silence in the great hall was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. The shocked paralysis that had gripped the court during the initial exchange had deepened into something closer to disbelief, because what they were witnessing violated every assumption that underpinned their society. Humans didn't overpower Lycans. Servants didn't put princes on the ground. The natural order didn't invert itself during a state banquet while the nobility watched. Yet here it was, happening in real time, undeniable and impossible in equal measure. Lord Castor had gone pale, his goblet frozen halfway to his lips. Lady Mareth had a hand pressed to her mouth, her carefully cultivated composure shattered. The younger nobles who had laughed at Kaelin's philosophical inquiry now looked like they had witnessed something profane, something that threatened the foundations of everything they believed about their place in the world. And still Naira held the prince pinned with that same terrible ease, as if she could maintain this position indefinitely, as if his continued immobility required no effort whatsoever. Her breathing hadn't changed. Her expression remained calm, almost clinical. She looked like a surgeon who had made an incision and was now waiting patiently for the patient to stop thrashing so the real work could begin. Beneath her knee, Kaelin had stopped struggling. Not because he had accepted defeat. His pride would never allow such a surrender, but because his body had finally communicated what his mind refused to acknowledge: he was outmatched. Every instinct that had been honed through centuries of predatory evolution was screaming at him that he was in the presence of something more dangerous than himself, something that understood violence in ways his privileged existence had never required him to learn. 3 years, Naira said softly, her voice pitched for his ears alone but carrying in the deathly silence. 3 years I've watched you and your kind test human reflexes. Break human bones. Study human fear like it was a recreational subject. She increased the pressure on his wrist fractionally, just enough to make him gasp. Did you learn anything useful, Your Highness? Or shall I provide a more comprehensive education? The question hung in the air like a blade balanced on its edge, waiting to see which way gravity would pull it. And in that moment, every person in the Great Hall understood that something fundamental had shifted, that the carefully maintained fiction of Lycan supremacy had developed a crack that no amount of force or denial could seal. The voice that shattered the silence came from the shadows beyond the chandelier's reach, deep and measured and carrying the kind of authority that made even the most arrogant nobles straighten their spines reflexively. Release him. High King Thorn Ironblood stepped into the light with the deliberate pace of a predator who had never needed to hurry because nothing in his territory could outrun him anyway. He was a massive figure even by Lycan standards, broad-shouldered and battle-scarred, his silver-streaked hair pulled back to reveal features that had been carved by 7 decades of absolute rule. But it wasn't his size that made the court collectively hold its breath. It was the intelligence in his amber eyes, the kind of cold analytical focus that had kept him on the throne through 3 separate assassination attempts and 2 civil wars. Those eyes were fixed on Naira with an intensity that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with recognition. She released the prince with the same controlled precision she had used to pin him, rising to her feet and stepping back before Kaelin could process that he was free to move. He scrambled upright with none of the grace he had displayed earlier, his face flushed with humiliation and rage, already opening his mouth to demand her immediate execution. Silence. Thorn's command cut through whatever protest his son had been preparing. Return to your seat. Now. Kaelin hesitated, clearly torn between obedience and the overwhelming need to salvage his shattered pride. But something in his father's expression, or perhaps in the way the High King continued to study the human Maid as if she were a puzzle requiring his full attention, made him swallow whatever words he had planned. He retreated to his place among the nobles, leaving Naira standing alone in the center of the hall. Thorn circled her slowly, his gaze cataloguing every detail. The way she held herself now that the servant's posture had been abandoned. The controlled breathing that spoke of cardiovascular conditioning far beyond what any maid would possess. The placement of her feet, balanced and ready, the stance of someone who expected violence and knew how to answer it. But most importantly, the specific techniques she had used, the pressure point manipulation, the leverage-based immobilization, the economy of movement that wasted no energy on theatrics. "What is your name?" he asked, though his tone suggested he was asking something far more complex than simple identification. "Sailor, Your Majesty. I serve in the—" "Your real name?" The interruption was gentle but implacable. "The one you were given before you learned to make yourself invisible." Naira felt something cold settle in her chest. 3 years of perfect concealment, and it had taken less than 30 seconds for someone to see through it. But then, Thorn Ironblood hadn't maintained power for 7 decades by being oblivious. And if he recognized the techniques, that meant he knew what they were, knew where they had come from, knew what their existence implied about programs that weren't supposed to exist. "I've seen those movements before," Thorn continued, his voice dropping to a register meant only for her ears despite the watching court. 20 years ago. During the border campaigns. There was a unit, officially it never existed, officially the reports were falsified, officially everyone involved was either transferred or buried in unmarked graves. He paused, and something that might have been respect flickered across his features. They called it Project Nightstock. A human response to Lycan superiority. A way to forge weapons out of flesh that couldn't transform but could learn to kill things that could. The great hall had gone so quiet that Naira could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of dozens of eyes watching an exchange they didn't fully understand but recognized as significant. The program was terminated, Thorn said, and now there was something harder in his voice, something that suggested he was evaluating threats and calculating responses. Every facility dismantled. Every operator accounted for and neutralized. Every record erased from existence. His eyes locked with hers, and in that moment, Naira saw her own death being weighed against whatever strategic value he thought she might possess. "So tell me, Ghost, how does someone who officially never existed end up serving wine in my citadel? And more importantly, who sent you?" The cells beneath Ironblood Citadel were not uniform. The lowest levels housed the traditional dungeons, stone chambers designed for breaking bodies and spirits through cold and isolation and the slow erosion of hope. But the upper levels, the ones accessible only through corridors guarded by the king's personal security, served a different purpose entirely. These were rooms built for guests who existed in that uncertain category between prisoner and asset, individuals too valuable to execute but too dangerous to allow freedom. Naira's escort consisted of 4 of the king's shadow guard, elite soldiers who moved with the disciplined silence of professionals who understood that the woman they were accompanying had already proven capable of neutralizing a royal prince. They hadn't shackled her. Hadn't drawn weapons. But their positioning made it clear that any attempt at escape would be met with lethal force, and unlike Kaelin, these were warriors who had earned their positions through competence rather than birthright. The room they brought her to could almost have been mistaken for guest quarters. Almost. The bed was furnished with actual linens rather than straw. The walls were smooth stone instead of rough-hewn rock. A wash basin stood in one corner, and the single window, barred naturally but still present, allowed a slice of moonlight to paint silver across the floor. But the door was reinforced iron, the lock mechanism complex enough to require specialist knowledge to pick, and the faint smell of old blood suggested this chamber had hosted previous occupants who had not left voluntarily. "Someone will bring food within the hour," the lead guard said, his tone professionally neutral. "The High King will summon you when he's ready. I'd suggest you rest while you can." His eyes held a warning that didn't need articulation. Whatever interrogation was coming would require all her resources to survive. Then they were gone, and Naira was alone for the first time since the banquet had dissolved into shocked whispers and urgent conferences among the nobility. She moved to the window first, testing the bars with pressure that confirmed they had been installed by someone who understood structural engineering. The drop below was significant enough to kill, even for someone with her training. The door was equally uncompromising, its hinges positioned on the exterior where they couldn't be compromised. It was a very well-designed cage for someone the king considered interesting. Naira sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself the luxury of dropping the mask completely. Her hands were steady despite the adrenaline still filtering through her system. Her breathing remained controlled despite the cascade of variables she was now calculating. 3 years of preparation had just collapsed into a single moment of exposure, and now she was navigating terrain she had anticipated but hoped to avoid. Thorn Ironblood's recognition changed everything. The fact that he knew about Project Nightstock meant he had been involved in its termination, which meant he understood exactly how dangerous its operatives could be. But it also meant he knew the program had been officially sanctioned before it had become politically inconvenient, which suggested there were records somewhere, evidence that could implicate people who currently held power. That knowledge was leverage. That knowledge was survival. But it also meant she was now visible in ways she couldn't afford. The careful anonymity that had allowed her to move through the citadel like smoke had been shattered. Whatever she did next would be observed, analyzed, countered by someone who possessed both the intelligence and resources to be genuinely dangerous. The door's lock mechanism clicked with a precision that announced the arrival wasn't a guard. Naira rose smoothly, her body automatically shifting into readiness despite knowing that any fight now would be futile. The figure who entered wasn't Thorn, but an older woman dressed in the practical clothing of someone who served functions more complex than simple domesticity. She carried a tray of food that actually looked edible, and her eyes held the careful assessment of someone evaluating an exotic and potentially venomous creature. "The king wants you functional for what's coming," the woman said, setting the tray on a small table. "I'm told you haven't eaten since the banquet began. That was 5 hours ago." She paused at the threshold. "He also wanted me to tell you that we've moved your belongings from the servants' quarters. All of them. Including the items you kept hidden beneath the loose floorboard in the eastern corner." The door closed with a sound like a chess piece being moved into position, leaving Naira standing in her gilded cage, understanding with perfect clarity that the High King was demonstrating exactly how thoroughly he could dismantle her carefully constructed defenses whenever he chose. They came for her in the grey hours before dawn, when the citadel was at its quietest and conversations could be conducted without the ambient noise of court politics interfering. The shadow guard escorted her through corridors she had cleaned 100 times as a servant but had never been permitted to truly observe. Now she catalogued every detail: the spacing of the guard stations, the reinforced doors that suggested secure archives, the subtle variations in stone that indicated which sections were original construction and which had been added during later renovations. The chamber they brought her to was not a throne room or dungeon, but something closer to a war room. Maps covered one wall, territorial boundaries marked in various states of dispute or alliance. A heavy table dominated the center, its surface scarred by decades of strategic planning. And seated at that table, reviewing documents by the light of oil lamps that cast his features in sharp relief, was High King Thorn Ironblood. He didn't look up immediately when she entered, a power play so obvious it bordered on theatrical. But Naira recognized it for what it was, not arrogance but assessment. He was giving her time to absorb the room's details, to see the stack of files arranged before him, to understand that this interrogation would not be the crude torture session his dungeons usually hosted. "Sit," he said finally, gesturing to the chair across from him. Not a command barked at a prisoner, but the measured instruction given to someone whose cooperation he required rather than compelled. Naira sat, her posture neither defiant nor submissive, simply present. 3 years of invisibility had taught her how to become whatever the situation required, but here in this room, she sensed that deception would be both futile and potentially fatal. Thorn was too intelligent to be fooled by performances, and the files before him suggested he already possessed pieces of the truth she had spent years concealing. "I've been reviewing what little documentation survived the purge," Thorn began, opening the top folder to reveal pages so heavily redacted they resembled abstract art, black bars interrupted by occasional words. "Project Nightstock. commissioned 17 years ago by a coalition that included myself, the late Chancellor Harrow, and 3 other officials who have since died under circumstances officially ruled accidental. His amber eyes lifted to meet hers. The program's objective was straightforward: determine whether humans could be enhanced through training and biological augmentation to pose a credible threat to Lycan superiority. He turned a page, and Naira caught a glimpse of photographs, training facilities, operational summaries, casualty reports from field deployments that had never been publicly acknowledged. The results exceeded expectations. Your unit conducted 17 successful operations against rogue Lycan factions. 0 casualties among operatives. A perfect record. Thorne's expression remained neutral, but something in his tone suggested grudging respect. Then the political climate shifted. The coalition that had authorized the program decided its existence posed too many uncomfortable questions. If humans could be trained to kill Lycans efficiently, what did that say about our supposed natural dominance? What precedent did it set for potential uprisings? Naira remained silent, understanding that he was constructing a narrative, waiting to see where she would confirm or contradict his version of events. So the program was terminated. Facilities dismantled. Records erased. And the operatives, he paused meaningfully. The operatives were reassigned to border patrols where Lycan warlords would conveniently eliminate the evidence of their training. Clean. Efficient. Morally reprehensible, but politically necessary. Except someone survived, Naira said quietly, speaking for the first time since entering the room. Except someone survived, Thorne agreed. And not just survived, infiltrated the heart of Lycan power, maintained deep cover for 3 years, and demonstrated those forbidden techniques in front of my entire court. He leaned forward, his full attention now focused on her with an intensity that felt like physical pressure. So let's dispense with the pretense. You're not Sailor the Maid. That identity is a construction. What I need to know is who you were before the program, what you've been doing in my citadel beyond serving wine, and most critically, his voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. Whether you came here for revenge, intelligence gathering, or assassination. The question hung between them like a blade suspended over fragile thread. Naira felt the weight of the moment, understood that her next words would determine whether she left this room as an asset, a prisoner, or a corpse. She thought of the genetic suppressant she had been introducing into the royal bloodline for 3 years, thought of the slow-acting poison that was already rewriting Lycan biology at a cellular level, thought of the fact that everyone in this citadel was already dying and simply didn't know it yet. And she made her choice. My name is Naira Valerius, she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. And I didn't come here on anyone's orders, Your Majesty. I came here because I designed Project Nightstock. I created the program that you terminated. I wrote the protocols that turned humans into weapons. She held his gaze without flinching. And I've spent 3 years in your citadel making certain that what you tried to bury will be the very thing that destroys you. The silence that followed Naira's declaration stretched long enough for her to hear the oil lamps guttering in their sconces. Thorne's expression remained carefully controlled, but she caught the fractional tightening around his eyes that suggested her words had landed with more impact than he wanted to reveal. He was calculating now, running scenarios, evaluating whether the threat she represented was immediate or strategic, personal or systemic. Bold claims from someone sitting in my war room surrounded by guards who could end your life before you drew your next breath, he said finally, his tone measured but carrying an undercurrent of something sharper. If you designed Project Nightstock, then you understand tactical positioning. So tell me why I shouldn't simply eliminate the architect of a program that was built to kill my kind. Because I'm not your real problem, Naira replied, leaning forward with the confidence of someone holding cards she had been waiting 3 years to play. And because the person who ordered the termination of my unit, who profited from the program's existence while engineering its destruction, who has been systematically undermining your authority for the past decade, that person is currently sitting on your council, advising you on matters of state security. She watched recognition flicker across Thorne's features, watched him arrive at the conclusion she had guided him toward. Chancellor Malker Voss, he said, and the name carried the weight of suspicion that had clearly been forming long before tonight. Chancellor Malker Voss, Naira confirmed. The man who convinced you that Project Nightstalk was a political liability while simultaneously selling our operational protocols to the highest bidder. The man who arranged for my unit to be deployed to the Ashenfell border where rogue Lycan warlords would conveniently eliminate us. Her voice remained steady, clinical, but underneath ran a current of controlled fury that 3 years had done nothing to diminish. 17 operatives. The best humanity had ever produced. Sent to die not because the program failed but because it succeeded too well, and Voss realized he could monetize our techniques by selling them to your enemies. Thorn's hand moved to one of the files, flipping it open to reveal financial records that even heavily redacted showed patterns of irregular transactions. I've had auditors examining his accounts for 6 months. Unexplained wealth transfers, meetings with foreign delegations that weren't logged through official channels. But nothing concrete enough to move against someone with his political connections. Then let me provide the concrete evidence you need, Naira said. She reached into her sleeve, slowly, telegraphing the movement so the guards wouldn't react, and withdrew a small data chip that had been sewn into the fabric. 3 years of documentation. Weapons shipments that passed through the Citadel's lower docks under falsified manifests. Communications between Voss and the Crimson Fong territories discussing military technology transfers. And most importantly, the kill order he signed authorizing the Ashenfell deployment. She placed the chip on the table between them. I've been a very thorough maid, Your Majesty. I clean things. I observe things. And I collect things that powerful men assume no one is watching closely enough to notice. Thorn picked up the chip, examining it as if it might contain answers to questions he had been asking for years. If you had this evidence, why wait 3 years to reveal it? Why endure servitude when you could have exposed him at any time? Because exposure wasn't enough, Naira said, and now her voice took on an edge that made even the king's expression sharpen with renewed wariness. Because Voss is merely a symptom of a larger disease. He profited from selling human-killing techniques to Lycans who wanted to perfect their supremacy. He betrayed a program designed to level an unbalanced hierarchy. He represents everything about your court that needs to be cauterized. She met Thorn's gaze with the full weight of her purpose visible for the first time. I didn't infiltrate Ironblood Citadel to kill one corrupt chancellor. I came here to dismantle the entire system that makes men like him possible. And you expect me to help you, Thorn said, though it wasn't quite a question. I expect you to recognize mutual benefit, Naira countered. Voss is undermining your authority, selling your military secrets, and positioning himself to either replace you or control whoever succeeds you. I have the evidence to destroy him politically and legally. What I'm offering is a trade, his head for my temporary freedom of movement within your court. Let me finish what I started with the Chancellor, and I'll give you something more valuable than revenge. Which is? Naira smiled, and it was the expression of someone who had been playing a longer game than anyone had realized. The complete list of everyone he sold our protocols to. Every noble family, every foreign power, every rogue faction that paid for the knowledge of how to kill enhanced humans. You want to secure your borders? I'm offering you the intelligence to eliminate threats you don't even know exist yet. She paused. And all it costs you is allowing one ghost to remain visible long enough to settle accounts with the man who tried to erase her. Thorn studied her for a long moment, his fingers drumming a slow rhythm against the table's scarred surface. She could see him weighing variables, calculating risk against reward, measuring the value of her intelligence against the danger of keeping a weapon pointed at his court. Finally, he reached across the table and picked up the data chip, sliding it into a secure case that disappeared into his coat. You'll be assigned quarters in the intelligence wing, he said, his tone shifting into something that resembled negotiation between equals rather than interrogation of a prisoner. Limited freedom of movement, but you'll no longer be classified as detained. You'll report your findings on Voss directly to me, and once I've verified the accuracy of your evidence, we'll discuss terms for your continued consultation. He stood, signaling the conclusion of their meeting. But understand this, Naira Valerius. If you've lied, if this is an elaborate assassination plot, if you make any move against the crown or this citadel, you'll kill me, Naira finished, rising to her feet with a slight inclination of her head that might have been respect or might have been mockery. I would expect nothing less, Your Majesty. The guards escorted her back through the pre-dawn corridors, but this time their positioning had shifted fractionally. Still vigilant, still ready, but no longer treating her as a prisoner requiring maximum security. She had been reclassified in the span of a single conversation, transformed from captured threat into provisional asset. It was exactly the position she had been engineering toward for 3 years, the careful migration from invisibility to visibility to utility. The new quarters they brought her to were several levels above the gilded cage, windows that offered actual views rather than mere slices of sky, a door that locked from the inside as well as out. The message was clear. She was being given trust in carefully measured increments, each privilege contingent on her continued cooperation and the verification of her intelligence. Naira waited until the guard's footsteps had faded completely before moving to the window. Dawn was breaking across the citadel, painting the ancient stones in shades of amber and rose, illuminating the sprawling complex that housed the heart of Lycan power. From this vantage point, she could see the training yards where young nobles learned combat, the administrative wings where policy was forged, the residential towers where bloodlines that traced back centuries lived in luxury built on human subjugation. She thought of Thorn in his war room, already examining the evidence she had provided, already planning how to leverage it against Chancellor Voss. She thought of the court waking to news that the human maid who had humiliated Prince Kalen was now operating under the king's protection. She thought of how the pieces were moving exactly as she had designed them to move, how the players were dancing to rhythms they didn't realize she had composed. And she thought of the genetic suppressant. 3 years. 3 years of carefully measured doses introduced through food preparation, through wine she had served, through the very air circulation systems she had been granted access to while performing maintenance. A biological agent so subtle it produced no immediate symptoms, so sophisticated it required months to begin rewriting Lycan DNA at the cellular level. The research had taken Project Nightstock's final year to develop. The synthesis had required equipment she'd had to build piece by piece from smuggled components, and the deployment had demanded patience that would have broken anyone with less motivation. But it was done now. Irreversible. Already working its way through the bloodlines of every Lycan who had lived in or visited Ironblood Citadel over the past 36 months. High King Thorn, who thought he was recruiting an intelligence asset. Prince Kalen, who thought his humiliation was his greatest wound. Chancellor Voss, who thought his corruption was his most dangerous secret. All of them carrying poison in their veins that would begin manifesting within the next 6 months. The transformation would be gradual. Their healing would slow first, barely noticeable at first but progressively weakening. Then the partial transformations would become difficult, painful, eventually impossible. Their enhanced strength would fade like muscle atrophy, their predatory senses would dull to merely human ranges. Within a year, the Lycan aristocracy would discover they had become exactly what they had spent centuries believing themselves superior to: mortal, vulnerable, and utterly without the supernatural advantages that had maintained their dominance. Naira pressed her hand against the window's cold glass and allowed herself a smile that no one was present to witness. They thought she had infiltrated their citadel for revenge, for intelligence, for political maneuvering. They thought she was trading information for position, playing by rules she had learned to navigate. They thought the game was about evidence and leverage and careful negotiation. They didn't understand that the game was already over. She had spent 3 years as a ghost, invisible and patient, while she systematically poisoned the predators from within. She had endured humiliation and servitude while engineering the biological collapse of an entire hierarchy. And now, as they welcomed her into their inner circle, as they granted her the freedom to move among them as an acknowledged player rather than a hidden threat, they were bringing the architect of their extinction closer to the mechanisms of power she would need to ensure no cure could be developed in time. The wolves had already fallen. They just didn't know they were dying yet. And by the time they realized what she had done, Naira Valerius would have transformed from a weapon forged to fight monsters into the monster that finally ended them. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel for more werewolf romance tales, alpha kings, rejected mates, and powerful omega stories. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Leave a comment below telling me what you thought of this story and what kind of werewolf stories you'd like to see next. Your support means everything and helps me create more content like this. Thank you for reading, and I'll see you in the next.